Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith, and I'm excited today, Rodney. We have another guest in-house. We have Steve Smith with us. I've known Steve for probably over 20 years now. Steve Smith and I first became acquainted in Orlando, Florida, when he was in leadership at First Baptist Orlando, that large, beautiful church down there in Central Florida. Since then, he's been at Brentwood Baptist as the Minister of Communications, spent a lot of years there, here in the Nashville, Tennessee area, and more recently moved into the executive pastor role at First Baptist Church, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to see you.
You know, Steve, when Steve Neesmith, I'm going to get you two confused along the way today. When I say Steve or Steve, it's like, so Steve, you know, when Steve came and said that you were a lifelong friend of his and popped out and took a look at some of the things that we're doing, I was going like, man, that's so exciting. We're going to have a practitioner on today, you know, somebody that's actually in the seat and doing the job. And so I'm really excited about that. We're thankful that you're here, Steve.
It's my honor to be here. Yeah, always excited to share about what I do because I love it.
Yeah. Steve and I were doing a little kibitzing before we started recording here, and we've got a lot of things in common, and I think this is going to be an amazing interview for our listeners. So for our listeners...
Incidentally, I should point out that Steve Neesmith and I not only have known each other for over 20 years. We have very similar first and last names, right? we both went through the same master's degree program in Orlando at Rollins College. That's right. And we both then moved to Nashville, and then we both have served in church communications. So I don't know what that means, but there's something going on there.
I've got another one for you, Steve Smith. Our wives also taught school at the same time at different schools, but I believe even our wives were both school teachers. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, a lot of parallels there.
A lot of parallels.
So Steve Neesmith, let's get one thing straight. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Oklahoma is way too far out of you. No Oklahoma bound for Steve here.
Oh, I'm an East Coast guy. I think I'm on the East Coast, not the East Coast, but I'm a Southern East Coast guy. So I'm here to stay. I think
your next move's going to be Florida, I bet.
Oh gosh, who knows?
Well, once again, welcome. We're grateful that you're here, Steve. So listen, for those that are unfamiliar with the role of an executive pastor, I think it'd be really interesting for you to unpack that for us just a little bit. Tell our listeners, what is an executive pastor and what do they do?
Sure. Well, my favorite description of an executive pastor came from my former executive pastor, who I served with at Brentwood Baptist in Nashville, and who remains a dear friend and a mentor to this day. And his description of the executive pastor goes something like this. The executive pastor does everything that the senior pastor can't do, won't do, shouldn't do, but that if he did do, we'd all be in deep doo.
I like it. It's going to be a soundbite for us.
There you go. So I really like that description. But seriously, you know, I think the best way to characterize the executive pastor role, and there's so many different ways to characterize the purpose of that role, but I think the best way is just to assume that the executive pastor really is responsible for taking the overall mission and vision of the church, whether that's defined by the senior pastor or whether that's defined by an elder board or however the church is governed, to take that overall mission and vision and then break that down into strategies and tactics and objectives that can help the church reach that mission and vision.
Yeah, I loved, when we were kibitzing coming in, you were talking about, how pastors tend to see A to Z, but executive pastors fill in the blanks between B and Y. And I thought that was a really, really interesting way to put it as well. And so, we need both sides of that equation. We need the person that can see the vision and where we're going, and we need that other individual that can fill in the blanks. And so it's great when we can learn how to exercise that interdependence in our leadership.
Yeah, and it's not always true, but I think it's generally true that senior pastors tend to be visionaries, and they tend to be wired more for seeing the big picture and not being detail oriented, whereas executive pastors tend to be more conventional in their personality types and in their giftedness, and they tend to be more detail oriented and more of the executors of those kinds of things. So there's usually a complementing relationship there.
Yeah. So over the years, how have you navigated that water? I mean, in the work that we do, we tend to see a lot of times that's fearful for a senior pastor, to give that kind of authority to this executive pastor that's really implementing the strategy. And so what are some of the things that you've seen along the way that's kind of bridged that gap?
Well, I think absolutely essential in that relationship has to be the senior pastor's willingness and awareness to understand his own giftedness and his own areas that he's not gifted in. And I don't even really like to define those as weaknesses, because we tend to attach kind of a negative connotation to when we say strengths and weaknesses. It's not really about strengths and weaknesses. It's more about strengths and then acknowledging where we're not gifted or where we're not passionate or where we're not particularly skilled. And so I think essential in that relationship is the senior pastor's self-awareness and understanding what that is, and his willingness to relinquish control, relinquish decision-making authority, relinquish even some of his own ways of thinking in favor of those things that are just not part of how he's wired. And so that's probably the most important aspect of it.
Steve, I've got a question for you. I know we touched on it a little bit in the intro, but before we get too far in the interview, I'd be curious to know a little bit more about your path to the executive pastor role. You've worked in ministry leadership for decades now, probably going on 3 decades, actually. Could you bring us up to speed on where you started and what brought you to the role that you're in now?
Sure. Yeah. 31 years to be exact now in full-time ministry. When I was in high school, I was involved in my home church's television ministry in Savannah, Georgia. They had a broadcast television ministry, and I found a passion there, an interest, and then eventually felt like that was a call to ministry. That was in the days when broadcast television ministries were kind of building and growing and becoming a major force in the broadcasting world. Unfortunately, there were a lot of downsides to that too. That was in the era of the the televangelist falls and things like that. But I saw a lot of value in the local church context of broadcast television ministry, and so I felt like that was a ministry calling. So I got my degree in communications and emphasis in broadcasting and film, and started my ministry in television. In fact, it was to lead the television ministry at First Baptist Church of Orlando was what prompted me to be called to serve there. That was a church that had a 40-plus year history of being on local television, local broadcast, and I was brought on as a 25-year-old wet behind the ears communications and media minister to lead that tremendous ministry at that church. And I was grateful for their recognition of my abilities, but it was a big challenge for such a young person in ministry, but it was a tremendous opportunity for growth. And I was there for 13 years in that capacity. While I was there, my role broadened to include communications, the broader aspects of communications, including branding and promotions and media relations and those kinds of things. And so it really became a position that was there and was designed to sort of tell the story of the church, to reinforce who the church is and what we're about with the broader community outside of the church.
Steve, I believe you were there during the Pastor Jim Henry years. Is that correct?
I was. In fact, he was president of the Southern Baptist Convention when I first went there, and so part of my immersion into the media world was in seeing and being a part of representing him and his role as his nationally recognized role as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
What a beloved pastor, one of the all-time greats. I put him up there myself in the category of even the Billy Grahams of America. So that's wonderful that you got to serve under Jim Henry. Sorry to interrupt you. I want to let you keep going there.
No, I just have to add that I am tremendously blessed to have been able to serve with Jim Henry for over a decade, and I credit him and his influence on my life tremendously for where I am today. He is 84 years old now and still going strong. I spoke to him just a few weeks ago, and just a tremendous man of God and a tremendous example for thousands of people. But that role there then eventually led me to a similar role at Brentwood Baptist in Nashville, as they were just trying to begin to figure out what communications looked like for them at a phase and stage of their life, their church life that needed that. And so during my tenure at Brentwood Baptist, my 13 years there, we went from one campus located in Brentwood, Tennessee, to 8 campuses around the Nashville area. And so I was able to be, as opposed to having a focus on broadcast television, it really became more about creating and being a part of figuring out what an organizational identity looks like in multiple locations in a community that it had been known for some time, but was redefining itself. So that was sort of the nature of my role there at Brentwood. And I credit my time at Brentwood with developing a love and a passion for the organizational health of the church, because I believe, Brentwood was not by any stretch a perfect place, there's no perfect church, there's no perfect organization, but they, at that time, did things in such a way that I thought just was exceptional in terms of organizational growth and health. And the former executive pastor, Jim Baker, that I mentioned earlier, is to be credited tremendously for a lot of that. But that's where I developed my love and my view of the overall health and growth of the church. Not to mention the fact that I had surrendered to full-time ministry back in my late teens, and I felt like that was a call to full-time vocational work in the local church for the rest of my life. And so I realized that if communications is, if things have kind of run their course in communications, then what is the next step for me? I knew I wasn't called to preach. That's never been my calling, to be a senior pastor, but I believe I'm called and gifted and passionate to do just what I'm doing now, which is the executive pastor role.
So it seems like to me, kind of at the core of your heart, what I'm hearing just like ooze out of you as a leader is just humility and self-awareness. So I would assume that would be at the heart of a great executive pastor. Tell us a little bit about what makes a really good executive pastor.
Yeah, Rodney, those are the 2 words that I have latched onto for the last few years. I believe that those 2 characteristics are not only what makes a great executive pastor, but what makes a great leader in any context, and that those things are self-awareness and humility. I think those 2 characteristics cover an awful lot of ground in organizational life and leadership, in leading people and having people follow you and those sorts of things. Self-awareness is important because we can only lead as far as we understand ourselves, and then we understand how we're seen. There's a lot of a buzzword in leadership these days is emotional intelligence, and that involves self-awareness. How do we are we aware of how we are perceived by other people and what the impact and the implications of that is? That's a big part of leadership. And then humility covers an awful lot of ground too. And I can say that in church life, I think anecdotally that almost any situation you can look at that all of us know about where churches have imploded, or there have been church splits, or there have been leaders dismissed, any of those kinds of things, almost always there's a component of lack of humility involved in that among the leadership. And I think sometimes that just goes with the territory. We expect our leaders to be confident. We expect them to be strong. We expect them to be, in many cases, all-knowing. And so sometimes there's a pride that goes along with that. There's a sense of building up of self. And I think in order for an organization to be truly healthy and not go down that road toward potential conflict and implosion is a tremendous ability to be humble in any and every situation.
I just, love the way in which you talk about humility and self-awareness, and I think that they're at the heart of great leadership. I couldn't agree more. And at the heart of leading from your strengths is truly, are you humble enough as a leader to invite people into the things that you don't have? And are you humble enough as a leader to take what God has so freely given you and freely give it away to the people in which He's placed around you? We see that as each one of us do our work, that the body becomes mature, not lacking anything. And I think that takes a great level of self-awareness. What do I have to give away? Freely give that away. And what I don't have, invite somebody into that. And that requires great humility. So I think we sing off the same hymnal. I think those words would be very, very encouraging for our listeners to hear and reinforce all the principles in which we've been teaching along the way. This thing called leading from your strengths. And so, what are some of the trends that you tend to see happening inside of ministry these days? Staff structure changes, especially post-COVID, strategic changes in church models. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, as far as staff structures go, I'm not sure that there's anything new under the sun there. My observation is that even within the specific tribes of churches, denominationalism, and those kinds of things, that staff structures still vary widely from church to church, depending on the particular circumstances of that church. But I do think that there is a trend away, and this is even pre-COVID. Even pre-COVID, I think that there was a trend away from what I would call mega church mentality. There's a trend away from the attractiveness, the build it bigger and they will come kind of mentality. I think that our culture and the later generations behind ours are now less enamored with big and impressive, and they're less enamored with spectacle. And they're much more committed to and desiring of relationship and community and authenticity. And so I think many of the trends we saw in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s that mega churches would emulate, I think have gone by the wayside. And then COVID comes along and even throws us another curve and kind of redefines what church ministry looks like there. So I think we're seeing a move away from consistent church attendance. I think COVID pushed even some of our most faithful members and most faithful church participants to a less frequent attendance on a regular basis. And so we're having to deal with the realities of that. What does it mean for our attendance to perhaps never get back to pre-COVID levels again? And is that okay? What does that mean? It forces us to focus, I think, more on quality than quantity, and on depth rather than superficial things. So I think the trend toward multi-site has kind of waned a bit. That was the big buzz 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I think that that's sort of tied in some ways to the trend away from megachurch. So in the same way that this new generation is not enamored with spectacle, they're also not enamored with personality. And I think a lot of multi-site models were built around the personality of the pastor and the video venue concept of multiplying that pastor's teaching platform through multiple venues. I think there's not as much appeal to that anymore. So I think there's a move away from multi-site and maybe more toward church networking, churches being independent of one another, but still having some kind of a close affiliation with one another, partnerships, even outside of the denominational affiliations that they have. So those are some of the trends I'm seeing. I think from a discipleship standpoint, there's been a trend away from a pure discipleship education and more toward disciple multiplication. The buzz now in church life is multiplying disciples, not even just making disciples, but multiplying disciples. So we're looking at what does it mean to not just bring people to faith in Christ, but to have them conformed into the image of Christ in such a way that they then go and multiply themselves as well. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing and that we deal with on a regular basis here at First Baptist.
Rodney, this is why I love having guests like Steve Smith on the show. Just to hear that report from the front line is so insightful, and I know a lot of our listeners really appreciate his insights as well. Steve, I'm curious, you've been a senior leader for a long time, and some of the most significant churches in the country. I'm curious what challenges you see senior leaders in ministry facing these days.
Well, I think it probably goes without saying that one of the biggest challenges that church leaders are facing this day is the changing winds in our cultural and political landscape. The recent politics of the White House have certainly made a tremendous impact on evangelicalism and and what it even means to be an evangelical in America. And it has unfortunately divided churches and divided people who were once very much in unison and united on so many fronts. And we even now see a fracture there among evangelicals who see things a little bit differently from that political perspective and that political influence. We can no longer assume the same things that we might have assumed about our mutual politics from 25 years ago. So that's created some challenges there. And I think it's caused church leaders to have to either decide to fully engage with one or the other side as they're defined of those debates and those positions, or to retreat from it and try to just be neutral. And both of those approaches brings challenges, obviously, because you're going to make a certain number of people unhappy whichever approach you take. So trying to navigate and find that fine line between the appropriate standing on conviction. The way that I like to posture that, though, is that what we have to focus on is what our common convictions are. We can have common convictions from a theological, doctrinal, biblical standpoint, but we can have different postures in how we approach those different and difficult questions in our culture and in our politics. As long as we're committed to the same convictions, I would like to think that we can be careful enough and be kind enough and be gracious enough with one another to make sure that our posture is a Christ-like posture in dealing with those things.
Like the old saying goes, keep the main thing the main thing.
That's right. That's right.
We got more and more young people entering the ministry nowadays. The seasoned guys out there can kind of handle and navigate some of these changing culture and political landscapes. But, kind of what advice would you give to that young leader today, to help them increase their chances of being successful as a leader in the church?
Yeah, there are so many things that could be on that list, from a very general basis to a very specific basis, but I'll try to summarize a few things that I think are important. One goes back to something we've already talked about, and that is self-awareness. I think if the earlier that someone can begin to learn about themselves in their ministry life, the better they're going to lead, and the more effective they're going to lead for a longer period of time. I think, unfortunately, a lot of us in leadership did not begin that journey of self-discovery until much later, because we weren't encouraged to, we weren't prompted to. There's been, even in the church, or maybe especially in the church, there has been some degree of antagonism in the past behind the idea of getting professional help for things, and that may look like an executive coach, or it may even look like, in some cases, a therapist. There's been an aversion, because that seems to indicate or seems to imply some degree of weakness or lack of personal strength. But I believe those things are not only helpful, but they're necessary for us to engage in order to help us understand ourselves better, because there are people and resources who are skilled and trained at how to assess who we are and how we're wired and how that plays out in our relationships and our leadership settings and things like that. So self-awareness is something that I would encourage leaders to, new leaders, young leaders, to take advantage of. The second one would be to decide very early on a commitment to the utmost integrity in everything that they do. Our churches have faced, like every other facet of life in entertainment and corporate life, the church has also had its fair share of criticism and attack when it comes to our failings in sexual abuse cases and taking care of children and things like that. So I believe now more than ever, we have got to be sure not to just meet the minimum standard of integrity when it comes to finances, when it comes to sexual abuse scenarios or behaviors in the church, but we've got to exceed that standard so that the possibility of our being scrutinized and failing in those things is much less. So commit early on to just having the utmost integrity in everything that we do. Transparency, integrity, openness, honesty has got to be at the forefront of everything that a leader does.
I'm going to say a big amen to that. That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing that comes to mind in that is just a kind of a personal story for me in church leadership. I think my generation, there's been a bit of a de-emphasis on theological education. A lot of times the idea was, especially in Southern Baptist life, that may be different in other denominational settings, but in Southern Baptist life, there was a bit of an attitude of, you don't need seminary, just start serving in the church, you'll get all that you need. And it was much later in my life, in my ministry life, when I went back and got my seminary degree, got some theological education. But I think that in the culture in which we live, in the day and age in which the scrutiny exists on leadership and on the church, I think that theological education is more important than ever. We've got to have a foundation on which to build that which we teach, that what we believe, what we lead our people to do. And, of course, selecting the right theological education is important there too. But I just think that I think for anybody in church leadership, if they can manage it, I would put just being sure that theological education is part of their development is very important.
Yeah, the core of our mission is about building strong teams, and strong teams are built by leaders that are strong leaders, and leaders that really can build empathy and trust and maintain that empathy and trust to lead with integrity. And so I think it'd be interesting for for our listeners from your perspective, to hear from you what you think is required to build a strong team and to maintain a strong team.
Yeah, I think from a very practical standpoint, building a strong team starts with simply selecting the right people to serve on the team. And we have a process here that I picked up on in my time at Brentwood that I've brought with me to my role here. That it takes a very intentional approach to personnel selection, to hiring the right people into the right roles. And the concept behind this particular principle is that before you even begin to think about a candidate for a role, you actually define the picture of the ideal candidate for that role. And in painting that picture and drawing that picture, you define not only the job description and the role and the tasks and the things that the person needs to be skilled at doing, but you also define what the characteristics are, the personality, the passions, the spiritual giftedness, the abilities, the past life experiences. You put all that into what this profile of the ideal candidate looks like. And only then, once you've drawn that profile, that picture, do you then go try to find candidates to fit that picture. And one of the things that I've seen in church life so many times is that leaders, pastors will have this buddy that they knew from seminary or that they served with at their previous church. And they're just like, I've got to have him on my team. And they'll create a position, or there'll be an open position, and they'll just plug that guy into the open position because they want so desperately for him to serve with them again. And he's a terrible fit for the position, and he fails in the role. So I would encourage church leaders to not even talk about or look at particular candidates until that picture has been drawn, and then identify at least 3 qualified candidates for that role. And you identify the qualified candidates. You don't start comparing them to one another until you have first compared them to the picture. And only after you've compared each of those candidates to the picture and feel like they satisfy the qualifications of that picture, do you then start comparing them to each other in order to determine which one best fits the role. So personnel selection is just really important and so high on the top of the list.
Man, I want to stop and camp here just for 1 minute. So let me just ask you a question. Okay, it's not a hard question, but here it is. So let's say you hire that buddy and they don't fit the role. And 6 months later, you've got a performance problem. How do you solve that?
How do you solve a performance problem? Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. You want me to answer that?
No, it's kind of a tongue in cheek. It's like, it's almost impossible to solve that problem. Yeah. And what you think that you're doing is, that's right. What you think that you're doing is admirable and good for the body of Christ might actually have some detrimental, consequences. And then what we do is we start putting pressure on our buddy to be somebody that God didn't call them to be. And then we
That's right.
find our buddy exiting the ministry, and now we've lost a relationship, and we've hurt a lot of people along the way if we're not careful.
That's
And
right.
so I really, we as Scribe for sure about painting a picture of what that role looks like. We have tools to help people do that. I love your process, and I think that it would serve the church well to make sure we know what we're looking for before we start looking. I think it's really, really important. I'm sorry to cut you off. I know you have more to say here.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just going to try to move on to how do you maintain a healthy team and a strong team, and I think to me one of the ways to define that is it boils down to communication, 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 and when I'm trying to characterize what good communication looks like, there are two words that come to mind that I reinforce with our team all the time, and those two words are clarity and intentionality. If we are absolutely clear in our messaging and in our expectations, then we're going to go a lot farther in having a culture of people understanding who we are and where we're going together. And then intentionality. I see so many churches try to do things without really defining what it is we're trying to do. So we want to be intentional about everything we do. And intentionality involves things like sitting down together on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or quarterly, and intentionally going through a set of conversation-driven questions about how the individual is doing, what their goals, where they are on their goals. Do they have any issues that need to be addressed? Is there anything that I can do to help them succeed in their role? So those conversations, we think that they happen incidentally, but many times they don't. So unless we set aside time to intentionally have those conversations, many times they don't happen. And then the third thing I would say is that I think maintaining a healthy team culture is to simply listen. Steve may know this because he and I went through the same master's degree program at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. But there was an entire course on listening leadership.
I love that was my favorite course. I promised to the listeners we did not rehearse this.
No.
I have said many times, I even remember the professor's name, Dr. Rick Baumelsje.
That's right. He wrote the book literally on listening leadership. And it sounds so simple and it sounds so straightforward, but yet it's so neglected in organizational life. Is just to listen to other people, listen to their hearts, listen to where they're coming from, listen to what challenges they face. Listen more than you talk. I think a lot of leaders are just predisposed by their personality to be the drivers in the conversation and to carry the conversation. And I'd encourage my leaders, and I try to model, just be a listener for a while and just listen, just stop and don't feel like you've got to make a point. Don't feel like you've got to drive some point home or you got to interject some incredibly meaningful message. Just listen. And then kind of related to listening, something else that I think leaders, even in the church, tend to neglect is simply exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit. We teach and we preach and we call out the fruits of the Spirit all the time: love, joy, gentleness, patience, kindness, self-control. Those things, if we just simply exemplify those things with those that we lead and those that we serve with, that will solve a multitude of organizational and relational conflict problems, I think, that we see and that we have.
It's at the heart of esteem others higher than yourself, right? It's so important not only to esteem others higher than yourself, but don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. And it's at the core of everything that we've heard in this broadcast today. Humility as a leader at the core, self-awareness at the core. And so as we kind of come to the end of our time together, I think it'd be interesting for you to kind of summarize, to our listeners, if you could boil it down, what makes a healthy church? What would those bullets look like for you?
Yeah, let me see if I can run down those real quickly. I think, again, going back to, we're beating a dead horse perhaps here, but number one, humility of the leadership. And there's another concept that I think is closely tied to humility that I haven't touched on yet, and that is the concept that we talk about a lot here at First Baptist Church, and that's called borrowed perception. Borrowed perception is simply the perception of others. And a humble person acknowledges that he needs the perception of others in order to lead well. So humility means asking a lot of questions. It means listening. It means esteeming ourselves as less than others. And so I think number one would be humility and all that goes along with that. Number two, getting the right people in the right roles. We've already talked about that. I believe it was Good to Great, right? That first shared with us the idea of getting the right people on the right seats on the bus. And so there are some very important aspects of being sure that the right person is selected and placed and identified for the right roles in the organization. Number three, I believe that effective and intentional systems of accountability must be in place. And it's surprising to me how many churches don't have that, especially churches that are decidedly pastor-led. We have this concept. There's this concept called institutional authority versus personal authority. And so many churches and pastors think that they have to depend on personal authority and personal power to lead the organization. But they realize sometimes after decades of trying to lead out of their personal power and their personal authority that eventually that dries up. So the more that leaders can depend on what we call institutional power, institutional authority, which are, guess what? Predetermined mission, vision, values, objectives, systems, processes, outcomes, is the more that we can define those things together on the front end, the less a leader has to depend on the limited extent of his own personal power and influence, because that will eventually run out and will eventually not be effective for many of the people following. So that's number three, accountability.
Now, Steve, that'll
Yeah.
preach. I thought that you said that you weren't called to preach.
It will indeed preach. It will, yes. An open and collaborative decision-making and management culture. That's kind of a mouthful, but I think that I characterize that simply by trying to say that any organization is going to be better if its leadership team not only works together to collaboratively define and make decisions so that everybody feels like they have ownership in it, but then figure out the best way to share that and extend that to all levels in the organization. If they can have organizational buy-in, if they can feel like that they have at least 80% agreement with the overall mission, vision, value, they're not going to agree with 100% of what the leadership does. But if they can have 80+% agreement with the systems and processes and tactics of the organization, then the better off the organization will be, because they will have a cohesive team at all levels of the organization. So open, collaborative, decision-making culture. A willingness to change. There are two realities of life that we define in our management system that we use here. And those two things that we can count on are: you will be judged and things will change. Those are the two tyrannies of life. You will be judged and things will change. Mm-hmm. So we have to embrace change in a way that's productive, in a way that's healthy. And there are so many different wonderful resources for how to manage change and how to leverage the opportunities for change in an organization so that it is received rather than resisted. But a willingness to change and then managing that change in a healthy way, I think is absolutely essential to organizational health. And then finally, I would say effectively deployed systems and processes that don't hinder, but encourage and support growth and health. I think many church leaders, a lot of pastors that are wired as high D personalities, feel like that systems and processes are nothing more than bureaucratic red tape ways of holding us back. But a properly defined and a properly employed system and process should be the fuel for growth and development and advancement, not hindrances to those things. So those are some of the things that came to mind when I think about healthy organizations.
Wow. Well, that is I think that we taught a master class today, Rodney, on the podcast. I'm so pleased that Steve could join us. Steve, I'm going to change gears here and say that we're recording this podcast during the college football season, and we're near the end of the season. You don't have a dog in the hunt, do you?
I literally have a dog in the hunt. Yes, I'm a Georgia Bulldogs fan, and even though I moved away from Georgia when I was 24 years old, and I haven't lived there since, I cannot not be a Georgia Bulldog. So I am very proud of my Bulldogs right now, and I wish them the best in the SEC championship, and then hopefully once again the national championship.
I thought I remembered that you were a Georgia Bulldog fan, so I had to throw that in there before we ended the podcast today. And that has nothing to do with leadership, except for, well, it really has nothing to do with leadership. But I wanted to give you your shout out opportunity there.
Well, and I should point out that it's a little bit of a challenge now, because not only did I marry a Florida Gator, because I met my wife Brandy when I moved to Florida in the mid 90s, and she's a diehard Florida Gator, but now we also have a freshman at the University of Arkansas. Our daughter Olivia is now a freshman, so she's a Razorback. So I have to kind of balance my loyalties just a little bit as we navigate those waters.
Yeah, that's fun though. That's really fun.
Well, once again, Steve, thanks for joining us today. Our listeners have been blessed, guaranteed, and have taken away an amazing set of nuggets today and truths and wisdom. And we're grateful for sharing you being on the broadcast and sharing. And Steve, I want to remind our listeners that you serve as the executive pastor of First Baptist Church of Broken Arrow in Oklahoma, but you also have a blog. And I think there's some really good stuff out on that blog. I'd like to see you blogging more after reading a few of your articles. I would encourage folks to visit you at stevesmithonline.com. We'll put a link to that down in the comments area below. And I really appreciate you spending time with us today, Steve. God bless.
It's been my joy and privilege. Thank you.